I want to tell you about a Tuesday in April that I thought was going to be the most boring day of my life. It wasn't. I'm going to tell it the way I saw it because I was there, maybe 40 feet away, close enough to hear the man's voice crack, close enough to see the guard's eyes, and trust me, that part I'll never forget. But let me start at the beginning, because if I jump straight to the punch, you won't understand why what happened mattered so much. So stay with me. It was one of those London mornings where the sky can't make up its mind. You know the kind. Gray, but a soft gray, like someone smeared a thumb across a window. The air smelled like rain that hadn't decided to fall yet. There was that little bite to it, the cold that gets into your knuckles even in spring. I was outside Buckingham Palace. Now I'll be honest with you. I'm not a royal person. I don't follow any of it. I was only there because my sister was visiting from out of the country and she had this whole list of things she absolutely had to see, and the guards were near the top. So there I was, holding 2 cardboard coffees, waiting for her to come back from the gift shop, feeling a bit like a tourist in my own city. The crowd was the usual mix. Families, couples taking photos, a school group in matching yellow hats, the teacher counting heads over and over, looking exhausted before lunchtime. There were a few people with proper cameras, the big ones with the long lenses, the type who treat the whole thing like a wildlife documentary. And of course there was him. The guard. You've seen the photos, I'm sure. The tall black hat, the bearskin, that bright red tunic. He stood at his post like he'd been carved there. Didn't move. Didn't blink, or at least it didn't look like he did. People were posing right next to him, throwing peace signs, pulling silly faces, and he just stared straight ahead like none of it touched him. There was this one teenager, couldn't have been more than 15, who kept stepping closer and closer, daring his mates to do the same. "Go on," he was saying, "make him laugh." And his friends were giggling and the guard just stood there, stone, like the boy didn't exist. I remember thinking, what a strange job, to stand still for hours while the whole world pokes at you, to be looked at all day and treated like furniture. I actually felt a bit sorry for him in a way. I thought, that man is bored out of his mind. I had no idea. Now I need to tell you about the old man, because he's the heart of this whole thing. He came shuffling along the pavement maybe 10 minutes after I'd settled in to wait. I noticed him because he wasn't moving like the others. Everyone else was rushing, swarming, treating the place like a checklist. He was slow, deliberate. Each step looked like it cost him something. He was old, properly old. 80s, I'd guess. Thin white hair under a flat cap. A long coat that had seen better decades, the kind of brown wool that doesn't get made anymore. And on his chest, this is the part that stopped me, he had medals. A little row of them, pinned over his heart, polished, catching what little light there was. I didn't know what any of them were. I'm not the sort of person who can look at a medal and tell you what war it came from, but you didn't need to know. You could tell from the way he carried them. Careful, like they weren't decorations. Like they were people. He had a cane in his right hand, the wooden kind with the curved handle, and he was leaning on it hard. With his left hand he held a small bunch of flowers, just simple ones, wrapped in that thin paper they give you at the corner shop. He stopped near the railings, a little apart from the crowd, and he just looked at the palace for a long moment. Then he turned, slow as anything, and he looked at the guard. And something passed over his face. I don't know how to describe it exactly. It wasn't admiration, not quite. It was more like recognition, like he was looking at something he used to be. His chin lifted a little. His back, which had been bent, seemed to try and straighten, though it didn't get very far. He nodded at the guard, just once. A small, respectful nod, the kind men of that generation give each other. The guard, of course, didn't move, couldn't move, that's the job. But I swear, and I've thought about this 100 times since, I swear something in the guard's face changed. Not a smile, nothing so obvious, just a flicker, like a stone that's been in the sun and is, underneath, somehow warm. The old man stood there for a bit. He didn't try to take a photo. He didn't lean in close. He just stood quietly at a respectful distance, the way you'd stand at a graveside. I found out later why, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My sister still hadn't come back from the gift shop. Typical. So I kept watching the old man because, honestly, he was more interesting than anything else there. That's when I first noticed the other one. The young man. He was maybe 25. Big lad, broad across the shoulders, wearing one of those gray tracksuits with the hood up even though it wasn't raining. He had a face that was already angry before anything had happened to make it angry, if that makes sense. Some people just carry trouble in their jaw. He was packing near the edge of the crowd on his phone, talking too loud, swearing every other word. People were giving him space without meaning to. You know how a crowd does that. Nobody decides to move away from someone, but somehow there's always a little bubble of empty pavement around the wrong sort of person. He finished his call, slammed the phone into his pocket, and he stood there, breathing hard, looking around like he wanted something to be wrong so he'd have a reason. I thought, please, mate, just keep walking. He didn't keep walking. Here's where it started to turn. The old man had moved a little closer to the railings. He wanted, I think, to lay his flowers somewhere near the gate. There's a spot people do that, leave little tributes. He was bending down, slow, both hands occupied, the cane in one and the flowers in the other, and he was struggling. His knees clearly weren't having it. He was lowering himself an inch at a time, gripping the railing, the whole thing painful to watch. And the young man in the tracksuit was right behind him. I think, and I've gone back and forth on this, I don't think it was planned. I think the old man was just slow, and slow people are an inconvenience to a certain kind of impatient person. The lad wanted to get past, to get to the front, to take his selfie or whatever it was, and there was this frail old body in his way moving at the speed of treacle. Move, the young man said. The old man didn't hear him, or didn't realize it was directed at him. He kept lowering himself toward the flowers. Oi, I said move, louder this time. A few people glanced over. Nobody did anything. That's the thing about crowds, everyone assumes someone else will handle it. The old man looked up, confused. Sorry, son, he said. His voice was thin but polite. Just a moment, my knees. And the lad, God, I still can't believe this part. The lad reached down and shoved him. Not hard enough to knock him over, not the first time. Just a shove on the shoulder. But the old man wasn't braced for it. He lost his grip on the railing. He stumbled sideways and his cane skidded out from under him, and the flowers, those little flowers, went scattering across the wet pavement. There was a gasp, a proper collective gasp, the kind you hear when a whole crowd reacts at once. The old man went down on one knee. Hard. You could hear the smack of it on the stone. He let out this small sound, not a cry, more like the air being pushed out of him. And the young man stood over him, not helping, not apologizing, just looking annoyed that the old body was now even more in his way. Get up, he said, stupid old. I won't repeat the rest. Now I want to be fair here, because I keep thinking about who I was in that moment. I didn't move. I'm not proud of it. I had 2 coffees in my hands and a thought in my head that went something like somebody should do something, and the somebody in my mind was definitely not me. I was frozen. There's this gap between knowing what's right and your legs actually obeying you, and in that gap, a lot of bad things happen in this world. But here's the thing about that morning. There was someone there whose entire being was built for exactly this gap. I just hadn't realized it yet. The old man tried to get up. He got one hand on the railing and pushed, but his arm was shaking and he couldn't manage it. His cap had fallen off. His white hair was sticking out at odd angles, and his medals, those medals, were now hanging crooked, half-twisted on his coat. He looked in that moment, smaller than anyone I'd ever seen. A woman near me finally found her voice. "Leave him alone," she shouted. "What is wrong with you?" The young man turned on her. "What did you say to me?" And she went quiet, stepped back, because he had that look, the one that says he'd be perfectly happy to make this everyone's problem. He turned back to the old man, and maybe it was the shouting, maybe it was the eyes on him, but something in him decided to double down instead of back off. That's how it goes with that type. Embarrassment turns to anger, turns to something worse. He grabbed the front of the old man's coat, bunched the wool in his fist, and he pulled the old man halfway up so their faces were close, and he drew his other arm back. A fist, cocked and ready, aimed at the face of a man who had to be 80-odd, who'd come there with flowers, who was wearing medals he'd clearly earned in some hell none of us could imagine. The whole crowd seemed to inhale at once. And that is when everything changed. I need to slow down here, because what happened next happened in about 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds have stretched out in my memory to last a lifetime. You have to remember where we were. The royal guard, the man in the bearskin, the one who hadn't moved a muscle in the whole time I'd been watching, the one teenagers had been taunting, the one people treated like a statue, the one I'd felt sorry for because I thought his job was to stand still and absorb the world's nonsense. He moved. And I don't mean he flinched, I don't mean he glanced over. I mean there was an explosion of motion, so fast and so sudden that half the crowd actually jumped back. One moment he was carved stone. The next there was the crack of boots on the ground, that distinctive double stamp they do, and a voice. A voice that cut through everything. "Stand back." It wasn't a shout exactly. It was bigger than a shout. It was a command, the kind of sound that goes straight past your ears and into your spine. It bounced off the palace walls. Pigeons scattered. The school kids in the yellow hats clutched at their teacher. And the young man, the big, angry lad with his fist drawn back, he froze. His arm stopped in midair. You should have seen the guard. Up close in motion, he was nothing like the still figure I'd been watching. He was tall, and now that he'd moved you could see the power in him, the way he held himself, the absolute control. He'd taken several steps forward from his post, which, I learned later, is itself a serious thing. They don't leave their posts lightly, and he had his rifle, and the whole of him was pointed at the situation like an arrow. But here's what got me. He didn't touch the young man. Not yet, he didn't need to. He just stood there between the lad and the old man, this wall of red and black and absolute certainty, and he looked at the young man with eyes I will never, ever forget. They weren't angry eyes. That's the thing. I'd expected fury, but it wasn't that. It was something colder and far more frightening than anger. It was the look of a man who had seen real violence, actual, terrible violence, and who had decided, a long time ago, exactly where the line was, and the young man had just put his foot right over it. The lad's mouth opened, closed. He still had the old man's coat in his fist. "Let him go," the guard said it slow, quiet now, which was somehow worse than the shout. I'd love to tell you the young man came to his senses straight away. He didn't. That's not how these people work. His pride was on the line in front of a crowd, and pride makes fools of even the cleverest, never mind a lad like that. "This isn't your business," he said, but his voice didn't have the same weight anymore. It wavered. "You can't even move. You lot just stand there. You're not allowed to do anything." And he actually, I can't believe I'm telling you this, he actually let go of the old man, shoved him back down toward the railing and squared up to the guard. Stepped right up to him, chest out, trying to reclaim the moment. "Go on then," he sneered. "What you gonna do, soldier boy? You're just for the photos." The crowd had gone dead silent. Even the traffic somewhere behind us seemed to fade. It was just these two men, and the old one on the ground between them, and all of us holding our breath. And I remember thinking, with this sick feeling in my stomach, he's going to throw the punch. He's actually going to do it. What none of us knew What I only learned afterward when the whole story came out was who that guard was. Not just his name, his history. I'll tell you about it properly later, because it deserves to be told properly. But I'll give you this much now, so you understand the size of what that young man was standing in front of. That guard wasn't just for the photos. That guard had stood his post years before, on a day when the ground itself had shaken. On a day when something went off near Hyde Park and the air turned to fire and noise, and people were screaming, and most men's instinct, the right human instinct, would be to run. He hadn't run. He'd stood. But like I said, I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, all you need to know is this. The young man in the tracksuit thought he was squaring up to a costume. He was squaring up to a man who had walked through hell and chosen, with his whole life, to stand between ordinary people and the worst the world can do. And he was about to find out the difference. The old man, down by the railing, had finally got himself half upright again. His hand was bleeding a little where he'd caught it on the stone. He was looking up at the two of them, and his face, I'll never forget his face either, his face wasn't scared. It was something like sorrow. He looked at the young man, this snarling boy who just shoved him to the ground, and there was no hatred in him, just a deep, tired sadness, like he was looking at everything that had gone wrong in the world, all at once, in one human shape. "Son," the old man said softly to the lad, "you don't want to do this. Believe me, I've seen where this road goes." The young man didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes on the guard, and he made the worst decision of his life. He pulled his arm back again, and this time he wasn't aiming at the old man. He swung at the guard. I'm going to stop right here for now. Because what happened in the next few seconds is the part that the whole crowd talked about for the rest of the day. It's the part the videos caught. It's the part that, honestly, I still don't fully believe even though I watched it with my own eyes. And it's the part where I learned that the man I'd felt sorry for, the one I'd thought of as bored, as a statue, as furniture, was the bravest person I have ever seen in my life. Stay with me. Because in part 2, I'll tell you exactly what the royal guard did the moment that fist came flying. And I'll tell you who he really was, so the fist came flying. I told you I'd pick up right where we left off, and I will. But I want you to picture it the way it actually happened, because in the moment it didn't look like the videos. The videos make it clean, slowed down. You can see every frame. In real life it was a blur and a sound, and a feeling in your chest like the bottom of a lift dropping. The young man swung, a big, looping right hand, the kind of punch a lad throws when he's angry and he's never really been in a proper fight, only the ones he's won. It came up in a cross, aimed straight at the side of the guard's head, at that bearskin hat at the face underneath. And here's the thing. It never landed. I've watched the footage since, loads of times, and even slowed right down, even frame by frame. What the guard did is hard to follow. He didn't step back. That's what your body wants to do when a punch is coming: flinch, lean away, get small. He did the opposite. He stepped in, toward it, into the danger, not away from it. His left arm came up in a cross, this short, sharp movement, and he caught the young man's swinging wrist on the bone of his forearm. Just blocked it dead. The punch stopped like it had hit a wall. You could hear it, this hard crack of bone on bone, and the young man actually grunted with the shock of it. And in the same motion, the same single fluid motion, the guard had pivoted, turned his hip, and the young man's own momentum was suddenly working against him. His big looping punch had nothing to hit and nowhere to go, and his feet were carrying him forward, and the guard just helped him along. Used the lad's own weight. The young man went down face first onto the pavement. Not thrown, not punched, just redirected, like water moving a leaf. It was over in less than 2 seconds. One moment, the lad was the most dangerous thing in that whole square. The next he was on the wet stone with his hood half over his face and his arm twisted up behind him, and the guard's knee was pressing, not crushing, just pressing into the small of his back, holding him there with this absolute, effortless control. The rifle, I should say, never even came into it. The guard had shifted it aside in the first instant, kept it clear, kept it safe. That detail stayed with me too. Even in the middle of all that, even moving that fast, he was thinking. He was in control of every single part of himself. The young man was thrashing, swearing, spitting out words I won't repeat about what he was going to do, about how the guard had assaulted him, about lawyers and his rights. The guard said nothing. He just held him, calm as a Sunday morning, and he looked up and he scanned the crowd, and in this clear, steady voice he said, "Police, now, someone call them." About 6 people fumbled for their phones at once. I want to tell you about the silence in between. Because once the young man stopped struggling, once he realized properly that there was no getting out of that hold, that he was completely and utterly pinned by someone far stronger and far more skilled than him, there was this strange, ringing quiet over the whole crowd. Nobody clapped. Not yet. It didn't feel like a moment for clapping. It felt like the moment after a car crash when everyone's still working out if it really happened. And in that silence, the old man spoke. He'd got himself up onto one knee. His hand was bleeding, his cap was on the ground, his medals were crooked. But he'd shuffled forward and he reached out, and he put his bloodied old hand on the guard's shoulder. Just rested it there. "It's all right, lad," he said, quietly, just to the guard. "It's all right now, you can let him be, the police have him." And the guard, who hadn't moved his face the whole time, who'd kept that cold, controlled mask on, the guard turned his head. Just slightly, just enough to look at the old man. And something broke in his expression. It wasn't tears. Don't picture tears. It was subtler than that. It was the look of a man hearing a voice he recognized in a place he never expected to hear it. The look of a son, almost, or a soldier hearing his old sergeant. The two of them looked at each other for a long second. And the old man nodded, the same small nod he'd given when he first arrived. That nod between men who understand something the rest of us don't. "You did right," the old man said. "You did right, son. Now, I have to tell you what I found out about the guard, because right about here is when the pieces started coming together, even though I didn't get the full story until later that evening. His name, I'll give it to you because it deserves to be said, was Daniel. Lance Corporal Daniel, of one of the Foot Guards regiments, the ones who do the ceremonial duty at the palace. But here's what people forget about those men in the bearskins. They're not actors. They're not hired to look pretty for photographs. Every single one of them is a serving soldier, a real one. They do the parade ground duty between deployments, between the actual wars, the actual operations, the actual places where people shoot at you. The man teenagers were taunting that morning, the one I'd felt sorry for, had served in places I couldn't find on a map without help. He'd carried friends who didn't come home. He'd done things and seen things that the lad in the tracksuit could not have survived for 5 minutes. And the standing still, the not reacting, that wasn't him being a statue. That was discipline, the deepest kind, the kind that takes years to build. The ability to stand perfectly calm in the middle of chaos, to absorb the whole world's nonsense without flinching, and to know exactly, precisely when to move. That young man thought stillness meant weakness. He'd never been more wrong about anything in his life. The old man, by the way, I told you I'd come back to him, and I will properly in a bit. But while we're here, let me tell you the small thing that gutted me. When the flowers had scattered earlier in the shove, they'd ended up all over the wet pavement. Crushed, some of them. And while we were all standing there in the aftermath, while the guard held the lad down and we waited for the police, this little girl couldn't have been more than 7, one of the kids from the Yellow Hat school group, broke away from her teacher. Nobody told her to. She just did it. She went round, quiet as anything, picking up the old man's flowers one by one, gathering them back into a little bunch, wiping the dirt off them on her sleeve. And when she got them all, she walked over to the old man, who was still half kneeling, and she held them out to him. "You dropped these," she said. The old man looked at the flowers, looked at the little girl, and his chin went, just for a second, the way it does when an old man is trying very hard not to come apart in public. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you, sweetheart." And he took them, careful, like they were made of glass. I had to look away for a moment. I'm not embarrassed to tell you that. The young man on the ground had gone properly quiet now. Reality was sinking in. There were dozens of phones pointed at him, filming. There were witnesses everywhere. And there was a royal guard, outside Buckingham Palace, pinning him to the floor for assaulting an elderly veteran. He was starting to understand, I think, just how badly he'd misjudged the morning. "I didn't know," he mumbled into the pavement. "I didn't know I didn't see the medals." And the guard, still holding him, said the only full sentence he'd said to the lad since, "Let him go." "It wouldn't have mattered," the guard said. "Medals or not, he's an old man. You don't put your hands on an old man, ever." The lad didn't have anything to say to that. There was nothing to say. You could feel the crowd's mood shift. The fear was draining out of it, and something else was filling the space. Anger, partly. A lot of people were furious at the lad now. You could hear it muttering through the crowd. But mostly it was this swelling thing, this pride almost, in what they'd just witnessed. People were holding each other. The woman who'd shouted earlier was crying. The teacher with the yellow hats had her whole group gathered close, and she was talking to them low, telling them, I found out after, that they'd just seen something they'd remember their whole lives. And then far off, the sirens. That clean, rising, falling wail, getting closer through the London streets. The guard heard it too. He glanced up, found the direction, and then he looked back down at the lad and said, almost gently now, "Police are nearly here. You stay still, you cooperate, you make this easy for everyone, all right. You've done enough damage for one morning." And the strangest thing, the lad nodded, into the pavement, beaten in every sense. 2 police cars pulled up at the curb, and the officers came striding over, and there was that little flurry of activity, the radios crackling, someone taking the guard's account, someone helping the old man to his feet, someone cuffing the lad and reading him his rights. But I want to freeze it for a moment, right before the police took over, because there was one more thing that happened, and it's the thing I think about most of all. As the officers approached, the guard stood. He let them take the young man, and the second the lad was in police hands, the very second, not a moment later, the guard did something that took the breath out of everyone watching. He stepped back to his post. He picked up his rifle. He squared his shoulders. He set his feet in exactly the spot he'd been standing before all this began, and he went back to being still. Stone again, eyes front, face like a closed door. As if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just moved like lightning and put a violent man on the ground, and protected a frail old veteran in front of 100 people. The job wasn't done. His post still needed standing, so he stood it. And I tell you, that was the moment the crowd finally broke. That was when the clapping started. It rolled through us in a wave, the applause, and then cheering, people whistling, the school kids jumping up and down. The whole square of Buckingham Palace ringing with the sound of it. And the guard. He didn't react, not a flicker. He just stared straight ahead like he always had, like a man who'd never needed thanks for doing the right thing in his life. The old man stood there in the middle of all that noise, his recovered flowers held against his chest, the little girl still beside him holding his free hand, and he was looking at the guard with this expression I can only call love. Not romantic, the other kind. The kind soldiers have for soldiers. The kind that says, I know what you are, because I was it too. A police officer was gently asking him questions. Was he hurt? Did he need an ambulance? What was his name? And the old man answered them, but his eyes never left the guard. "I'm fine," he said. "I'm fine, thank you, just took a tumble." "Sir, that was more than a tumble. He assaulted you. We'll need a statement." "All right," the old man said. "All right, you'll have it." And then he said something to the officer that made her stop writing and look up. He said, "Do you know what day it is today?" The officer didn't know what he meant. "Today," the old man said quietly, "is the anniversary. That's why I came. That's why the flowers." He glanced toward the guard, then toward something further off in the direction of the park, in the direction of a memory none of us could see. "It's the anniversary of the day everything changed, for me, and for men like him." The officer asked, gently, "The anniversary of what?" And the old man told her. And when she heard it, she went very still. I'm going to leave it there for now. Because what the old man said, the anniversary, the reason for the flowers, the thread that connected him and the guard, and a day years before when the ground near Hyde Park turned to fire, that's the whole heart of it. That's the thing that turns this from a story about a thug getting what he deserved into something much bigger and much sadder, and in the end, much more beautiful. In part 3, I'll tell you the old man's story. I'll tell you what happened all those years ago, the day a bomb went off near Hyde Park, and what a young soldier standing his post, in the same red and black, in the same kind of bearskin, did on that terrible morning. And I'll tell you the connection between that day and this one. Because it's not a coincidence that the old man came here. It's not a coincidence that this particular guard was standing this particular post. Stay with me for the last part. It's the part that'll stay with you. The old man told the officer the date, and she went still. And I was close enough to hear most of it, and what I didn't hear that morning, I pieced together later, because this story stayed with the whole crowd and some of us went looking for the rest of it. So let me tell it to you the way I understand it now, properly, from the beginning of his story. His name was Albert. Everyone who knew him called him Bert. And a long time ago, more than 40 years now, Bert had stood the very same kind of post that Daniel was standing this morning. Same regiment, same red tunic, same bearskin, same square of London pavement, eyes front, perfectly still while the world poked at him. He was 19 years old. And one summer morning, while he stood his post, the world came apart. I'm not going to dwell on the worst of it because it isn't the kind of thing you describe for entertainment, and the people it happened to deserve better than that. But you should know the shape of it. A device, hidden, set to go off near where the soldiers passed, near the park, near the crowds who came to watch them. And it went off. There was a sound, Bert said. He told the officer this, and I heard it. There was a sound that he had never heard before and never heard since. Not really a bang. More like the air itself being torn in half, and then heat, and a silence that was worse than any noise, and then the screaming started. Men were down, horses were down. There was smoke and the smell of it and dust hanging in the summer air and people running, and people not able to run. And 19-year-old Bert, in his red tunic, with the ringing in his ears so loud he couldn't hear his own voice, Bert did not run. This is the part the old man said quietly, almost like he was ashamed of it, which broke my heart, because there was nothing in it to be ashamed of. Everything in me wanted to run, he told the officer. Everything. I was a boy. I wanted my mum. I wanted to be anywhere else on God's earth. But he'd been trained, same as Daniel had been trained, to stand, to hold the line, to be the still point that frightened people can look to and think, if he's not running, maybe it's not the end of the world. So he stayed on his feet, and he didn't think about being brave because nobody who's actually been there thinks about being brave. He just did the next thing and then the next thing after that. He went to the men who were down. He used his own hands, his own tunic, whatever he had, to stop the bleeding on a man he didn't know. He shouted directions to civilians, sent them away from the danger, kept the panic from turning into a stampede that would have killed even more. And next to him, doing exactly the same, was his best friend. Another young guard, Bert's age. They joined up together, trained together, stood post together, laughed together through 100 boring afternoons just like the one I'd been watching that morning. His name was Thomas. Tom. And Tom, that day, ran toward the smoke when every instinct screamed to run from it. He pulled people out. He carried a wounded man clear with the dust still falling around them. He went back, and he went back again. And on the third time, Tom didn't come out. The square outside Buckingham Palace had gone quiet around the old man as he spoke. People had drifted closer without meaning to. The police officer had stopped writing entirely. She was just listening, the way you listen when you realize you're standing in the presence of something much larger than a routine assault report. Bert wiped his eyes with the back of his bleeding hand and looked at the flowers the little girl had rescued for him. "I come every year," he said. "On this day, I bring flowers not for me. I'm still here, aren't I? I bring them for Tom and for the others, the civilians, everyone who didn't get to grow old like I did." He looked up toward the gates, toward the palace. "I come and I stand near the post and I remember what we were. Two daft boys in big silly hats thinking the worst thing that could happen to us was a tourist making us laugh." He gave this small, sad laugh. "And then I look at the lads standing the post now," he said, "and I think they don't know, they're so young. They think they're just here for the photos. They don't know what they'd do if the worst came, but I know, because I've seen it. They'd stand. Every one of them, they'd stand." He looked over at Daniel then. Daniel, who was back at his post, stone still, eyes front, like none of it had happened. "And this morning," Bert said softly, "I saw it. I saw a lad prove it. Stood there like a statue all day letting children poke at him, and the second someone needed him, he was there. Faster than I could blink." His voice caught. "Just like Tom, exactly like Tom. Now, here's the part I almost can't believe, even now. The part that, when it came out, sent a kind of shiver through everyone who heard it." The officer gently asked Bert if he'd like to thank the guard properly. Once the guard's duty allowed, she offered to pass on his details. And Bert said the guard's name. He said Daniel. The officer blinked. "You know him?" "No," Bert said. "Never met him in my life. But I heard one of the other officers say his name, Daniel." He paused. "And I'll tell you something strange. Tom, my Tom, the one who didn't come out, Tom had a baby boy at home that summer. A little lad he barely got to know. We all used to tease him about it. He carried a photo, wouldn't shut up about him." Bert's hands were trembling now. "That baby grew up. Joined the regiment, I heard, years later. Same as his dad. I lost touch. But I always wondered." The officer asked, very quietly, what the baby's name had been. And Bert said they named him after his father, of course, Thomas, but the lad goes by his middle name, I was told. Always did. His mother chose it. He looked up and his old eyes were shining. "Daniel. I want you to understand that nobody had planned this. There's no version of this where it was arranged. It was the rawest kind of coincidence, the kind that makes you wonder, just for a second, whether some things in this world are coincidence at all." The guard standing that post, the one who'd moved like lightning, who'd protected a frail old man from a thug's fist, who'd then gone straight back to standing still as stone, was the grandson of Thomas. Tom, the boy who'd run into the smoke near Hyde Park all those years ago and never come out. The boy whose flowers Bert had been carrying. The boy Bert had come on this exact morning to mourn. Bert had come to honor a man who died being brave. And without knowing it, he'd watched that man's grandson be brave in exactly the same way, on exactly the same kind of ground. The line hadn't broken, it had just been waiting. 3 generations long, in a red tunic standing a post. They told Daniel later, when his duty was relieved. They told him about Bert, about the flowers, about the anniversary, about who Bert had been to his grandfather. I wasn't there for that bit, but the officer was, and she told some of us afterward, and her own voice shook telling it. She said that when Daniel, this man of total iron discipline, who hadn't flinched while a fist flew at his face, when Daniel was told that the old man he'd protected that morning had stood beside his grandfather on the worst day of both their lives, had held his grandfather's hand as a boy, had carried flowers for him every single year for over 40 years. Daniel didn't say anything for a long moment. And then this serving soldier, this stone wall of a man, put his hand over his mouth, and his shoulders went and he wept. He asked to meet Bert, and they let him. I only saw the very end of it from a distance, as my sister finally found me. She'd missed the whole thing in the gift shop. Can you believe it? She's never forgiven herself. The two of them stood together off to the side, near the railings, away from the crowds. The old man and the young one, Bert in his worn brown coat with his crooked medals, Daniel, out of his post now, still in uniform but somehow smaller without the roll around him, just a man. I couldn't hear what they said. I didn't need to. I saw Bert reach up slow with both hands and straighten the collar of Daniel's tunic. A small thing, a fussing, grandfatherly thing, the kind of thing you do for someone you love. I saw Daniel bend down, he was so much taller, and let the old man do it. And I saw Bert take the little bunch of flowers, the ones the 7-year-old had rescued from the wet pavement, and press them into Daniel's hands. For Tom, from the man who never stopped carrying them. To the grandson Tom never got to know. Thug, by the way, because I know some of you have been wondering, the thug was charged. Assault on an elderly man, among other things, all of it caught on 100 phones from 100 angles. I heard he tried to claim the guard had attacked him, which would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic, given that the whole thing was filmed in color from every direction. The footage went everywhere. Last I heard he was looking at a sentence, and he'd become, for a little while, the most disliked man in the country. But honestly, I don't think about him much. He was never really the story. He was just the small, ugly thing that the morning happened to be built around, like a piece of grit that a pearl forms over. The story was the old man with the flowers. The story was the guard who moved. The story was a line of brave men, stretching back 40 years, through fire and smoke and silence, all the way to a boy in a big silly hat standing a post on an ordinary Tuesday, ready, the whole time, under all that stillness, to be exactly what his grandfather had been. I think about that morning a lot. I think about how I froze, how I stood there with 2 coffees in my hands and let someone else be brave. I'm not proud of it, but I've made a quiet promise to myself since then that next time, and there's always a next time somewhere, I won't be the one holding the coffees. And I think about what I'd got so wrong watching that guard at the start. I'd felt sorry for him. I'd looked at a man standing perfectly still and decided he must be empty, bored, less than the rest of us somehow for not reacting. I had it exactly backwards. The stillness wasn't nothing. The stillness was everything. It was the most full thing in that whole square. It was 40 years of trained discipline and inherited courage, held in a body that had decided, long ago, that it would not move for nonsense, but would move like lightning the instant it mattered. We mistake quiet people for weak people all the time. We mistake stillness for emptiness. We look at someone who isn't shouting and we assume there's nothing inside. But the bravest people I've ever known were the quietest. They don't tell you what they do. They just stand there, ordinary, easy to overlook, until the worst day of your life arrives. And then they're already moving toward it, while the rest of us are still working out what's happening. So the next time you walk past one of those guards, and you're tempted to pull a face or wave a hand in front of his eyes to see if he'll crack, don't. Just give him a small nod, the kind Bert gave, the kind that says, I know what you might be, I know what you might do if the worst ever came. Because under that big silly hat, standing still as stone, is very likely one of the bravest people you will ever walk past in your life. and he's standing there for you. He always was.